Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Signs You've Outgrown QuickBooks, Exploring Dynamics 365 Business Central. My name is Katie and I'll be the facilitator today. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question area in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen and we'll answer questions at the end. The session will be recorded and posted on our blog as well as shared with you early next week. Now, I would like to introduce our presenters today, Encore account executives Darren, Atkins, and Bodner. Lincoln, Darren, pass it over to you.
Well, perfect. Well, very nice to meet everybody. My name is Lincoln Bodner. I'm an account executive with Encore Business Solutions. I've been working with Encore for about 8 years, and I would say this is a very timely subject, or one that Darren and I were, wondering what we should talk about in one of these sessions. And, one of the obvious, 90% of what we do is pretty much work with people that are, organizations that are coming off of QuickBooks, and say some of the commonalities and, what drives them here, what are some of the experiences of moving to a mid-level ERP system like Business Central. So I think this would be a great topic to kind of have Darren and I, elaborate on some of our experiences here. Darren, would you agree with that summation?
Absolutely. And just so you know, I'm Darren Atkins. I've been with Encore Business Solutions for about 4.5 years. I've been probably working in this industry for about a quarter of a century. So I think between Lincoln and I, we must have about 500 years of experience and should be able to answer any of your questions. We like to keep it conversational. This is really for you and to provide you with information. As Lincoln said, we have these conversations almost daily, and we very much enjoy what we do, or we wouldn't be here doing it.
Perfect. Yeah. As Darren said, it sometimes feels like 500 years, but I think it would be a good 30 minutes having the conversation, as we have sessions like this all the time, and we very much like to have audience participation as much as possible. So, especially Darren is particularly good at speaking on his feet, so definitely put him to task through here. But in terms of the agenda today, we have 4 or 5 main areas that we're going to be looking at here today. Darren and I are going to be taking turns sort of giving some thoughts and comments here. We're looking at signs you've outgrown QuickBooks, why consider transitioning from QuickBooks. We're going to have a portion on Dynamics 365 Business Central, which invariably is where most of our clientele goes, is from the ERP side. Certainly Darren has decades of experience of working with Business Central, so it'd be very good to tap into that. We're going to finalize that in terms of, say, the Encore approach of how we work with clients that not only QuickBooks but other startup ERP systems, and often we work with clientele that could be very small mom and pop startups to very large multinational corporations. So very much a lot of what's going into this session today. We'll be finishing with a Q&A session. But hopefully we'll be getting some questions along the way. So maybe I'll start this rolling here. Signs you've outgrown QuickBooks. So part of I have a number. I've ran my own companies. I've worked in consultancy. I've worked in multiple industries and have something of a business background. But I would say, primarily in terms of my understanding of this, I actually am a QuickBooks user. So for 10 years when I ran my own company, I used QuickBooks, and very much for my purposes in a small startup, it did the job extremely well for me. It wasn't terribly sophisticated. We often allude to it as the box, what is coming out of the box in QuickBooks, and in my case, in terms of doing my taxes, helping me with my payroll, it did a very good job of that. And in terms of, I didn't really experience the general issue that, say many of our clients have is when you get to a growth trajectory of, is that box still working for you? And, as Darren will tell you, if are you working for the box or is the box working for you? So sometimes that limitation in terms of what QuickBooks can do for you. There's lots of samples of that, and certainly I'll pass it over to Darren in terms of maybe giving you
Yeah.
some common examples of what.
Yeah. And as Lincoln mentioned, we get these calls and have these conversations nearly daily, and we hear a lot from our customers about their challenges, limitations. Often they feel very limited in QuickBooks, or their company is growing, or it served its purpose, or it's not, and now it doesn't really meet their specific needs. Great for general bookkeeping, as Lincoln mentioned, but think about QuickBooks. It's very inside the box, and what you see is what you get. Very WYSIWYG, to use an old computer term. But the calls we have are companies who are, hey, we really have outgrown it. We can't get certain, reporting or visibility, or we can't perform certain specific functionality or automation that would help us perform our work more efficiently, or grow better. So there's at some point when the business is growing at a certain trajectory and speed, and they realize that their software is not keeping up, and not really helping them work, and that and the goal is to be working on the business, not being part of the machine and working in the business all the time, or being just a data entry clerk. You really want to be getting meaningful information from your systems, and being able to act on that and make decisions in a timely manner.
All right. Next slide, Katie, if you don't mind. Perfect. What are some barriers for companies? Well, I would say, maybe I'll pass this one back to you, Darren. You have good insight.
Yeah, I think certainly visibility and reporting. So, one of the key things, you've got all this great data. Maybe you've got transactions, maybe you have inventory, maybe you have different key performance indicators. Data oftentimes, that, again, we're talking about general purpose ERP software, and we'll get into that later. But QuickBooks is on the border of bookkeeping and ERP, which is enterprise resource planning, which means something a little more comprehensive to cover all the functionality of your business, or an enterprise, versus just, hey, keeping the books. So a lot of times, you've got all this data in the system, but to get it out, you have to compile it and spend a long time, maybe putting it in a reporting tool or Excel, massaging the information to get it into a meaningful format that you can then make decisions off of, instead of, hey, this is just in time. It's a world we live in. Everything's moving really fast. I need the data real time, or as close to real time as possible, so I can make a good decision when to get that inventory turns, or maybe it's certain things about the customer, or certain things about my finances, or financial or cash position, forecasting, etc., that you need right away. You can't wait for a week for someone in accounting or IT to get back to you with a report. So that was maybe that first sort of part of that.
Perfect. I'll take the next section here. What are some challenges of moving from QuickBooks? And you see on the point there, the first one that generally and somewhat obviously comes up is cost, in terms of going from QuickBooks or any other entry-level ERP system. Generally the cost of setup, configuration, training is generally low, let's put it that way. And when I guess a lot of organizations don't often understand that when you move to that mid-level ERP system, we'll be talking further about Business Central, and this absolutely applies to that. There's definitely a big step up in terms of cost. Sometimes, interestingly enough, not necessarily on running the software, but often in implementing, and that's where we're going from what is a box that can be commonly applied very cheaply or modestly in terms of price. When you move into a mid-level system, that's where we're often addressing those issues of what the challenges in the box and addressing them there. And that does take a certain amount of setup, configuration, sometimes customization, sometimes integration. So, Darren, did you have anything further on
Yeah,
that?
I was almost going to say the same thing. Realize these are configured systems. So as opposed to just, hey, you set up all your chart accounts and okay, I've got accounts payable and accounts receivable. That's great. Everybody's got that, but how do you want to do that? So we spend um, a good amount of time consulting with you and understanding that and fitting the product to you and finding the right tools. If you need additional tools to perform that. So realizing that there's a lot more options and flexibility. So what you're buying is a lot more automation. You spend a little bit of time now that the investment is you spend a little bit more time and money now for um, a great amount of automation and work that the system will perform for you and what it'll give back to you if you can wave your magic wand and name your wishes an ideal scene there. Some of these other challenges, costs, I would argue that licensing really is pretty competitive. I don't think the license, I think it's more just that initial one-time implementation. User adoption, it might be new for some of the users. A lot of times we're coming across users who have been with other companies before and they've used other, sometimes even larger ERP systems. So it just depends. Change management is part of that. If people have been doing it the way the ancients did it in the same way over and over and they don't know, there's a lot of funny anecdotes I'm not sure we have time for today, but they've been doing this the same way for thousands of years. How well will they receive a change in the way they're doing something and new interfaces? And I think once they get into it, they'll be able to appreciate, but that's sometimes a challenge for companies. Hey, we don't want to, rock the boat here too much and have an uprising and revolt, mutiny from our from our employees because we changed the software on them. So it's really including key players and stakeholders in the decision-making process and evaluating the software and getting them behind it is really helpful. Technical and functional capabilities, we kind of already covered that. We'll get into that more. Okay,
Yeah.
Katie?
Maybe one last thought before we move on, Katie, is I think it's often important when you're making that transition from QuickBooks or from entry-level ERP systems into the mid-level market, is it's very much aligning business processes flows to the technology, to the systems that we're working with. So that is a fairly complex, even at the simplest of times. So I think that's often something people don't often think about when they're moving from entry level into the mid market. So
And that's a good point. When we're aligning, people, processes, and the technology, there's a fourth point that we like to bring to the table, which is really important, which is strategy. So, we're adding in that human element. So now it's not just a random application like on your phone or piece of software, but we're actually looking at how does this align with your business and how will this take you to that next level, fulfilling the reason you're transitioning. So, okay, let's
all right,
move on.
moving on. What is Business Central? What a good question. I'm going to pass that one right over to you.
Okay, yeah. So Business Central, as you heard me allude to, is general purpose ERP software. When I say that, I mean it does 80% of what any business needs, which GL, your chart of accounts, bank accounts, AP, accounts payable, accounts receivable, inventory, and a host of other functions depending on which ERP. If you go out there and look at them, they're, you'll if you're in a search for new ERP, you'll find that they all have these things in common and generally do or approximately what any business does. How they do it and how efficiently and how well does that fit your business needs is really the question. And I say so it does 80% of what any business needs or does. Now that other 20% gets fulfilled through these conversations, consultations, setting it up, dialing in the software to meet your needs. If it doesn't, finding the right applications to extend that, or interoperability with, say, in this case, the rest of the Microsoft stack. Maybe it's better Excel integration, or with Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, Power BI for visualizations of data. So we definitely take a look at that. I don't know if you want to add something to that,
I
Lincoln, but
I do want to add something to that, Darren, as a matter of fact. But yeah, I guess maybe another concept to bring in here too is often when you're moving out of the box is, certainly for growing companies, and again, this could be a relative term, but, often, if you think of it in high level in terms of how you interact with your customers, how you interact with your supply chain, I would say, that's where Business Central is particularly strong in its adaptability in terms of how it can help integrate you with your suppliers, with your customers, uh, help you facilitate things like inventory, how you sell out into the market, how you bring in products into your company. So these are all, again, often you don't know this until it hits you. In how do you if say your main customer is Costco or Walmart and they require a electronic file transfer with them, sometimes you have to get out, because you need levels of customization. So sometimes there's real practicalities, and also sometimes when we just look at the broad transactional scale of what some companies do, it just makes, you have to have that level of customability, modification in something like Business Central to kind of
yeah.
facilitate large transaction flows. So there's things like this that come up. And, generally when we look at something like ROI, that's where, usually where these things, something like Business Central sells itself in terms of what is that pain point? What is driving you there? And if Business Central was able to solve that problem for you, what does that mean to you in the organization? So sometimes it's cost, sometimes it's risk, if it's maybe security or compliance that you have to fill, or cost savings. So often these are things that we work with Darren and I on a day-to-day
Mhm.
basis in terms of what does that mean to you, what's the impact for you, and what is the
And
ROI?
and you and
Go
I
for
would
it.
I would argue, kind of rolling back up a point or two here, is how do you know when it's time to change? Well, usually when you start finding yourself or your business in a lot of manual workarounds to get your work done. Like you hear that tongue in cheek. I've heard from my customers. I didn't make this up, but doing ERP by email and Excel, so common. I can't tell you how many times we get this. Or you get the shadow IT where you haven't really established an official system, so people are bringing their own devices. They're doing things in Excel, maybe on paper and pen and paper. However, they're doing it. They're getting the job done. And the thing is that it supports, if you just stayed exactly the same, it works, for what you're doing today. But if you suddenly have an influx of growth or something changes, it won't, your realization is we can't keep doing it this way. We have no visibility. They've got different siloed information. They've got things on spreadsheets here. They don't match this. And, you know, all we're doing is bookkeeping with the system. You really don't have a true system that's working for you and that's automated, that's going to help support that growth. So that's really important. And then when we get into the ROI, well, a lot of times CFOs think of ROI in terms of headcount. Will this save me a person? Or can we grow without having to add a lot more people? Maybe that's, we're lean and mean, and we just, need the automation to help support that growth and take us to the next level.
Or, maybe the nicer way of putting that, Darren, is often those people could be repurposed doing much more meaningful work
Yes.
somewhere else.
Yeah, or
This
just
is all.
extracting. Oftentimes, it's one person wearing many hats, and as you grow, you have to specialize and shed those hats. And sometimes it's one person doing 10 things. Well, if you could take off, hey, closing books, it takes us 2 weeks to close the books. Okay. And that person's time could be better spent working on and strategizing the business and optimizing growth and working on, meaningful deals that will help grow the business. That could be, pay for itself in spades. Okay. Next
All
slide.
right. Next slide.
So we alluded to this a little bit. Microsoft interoperability. So Encore is a Microsoft partner. Microsoft only sells this product through the partner channel, and the partners implement the software. Microsoft does not implement. Or when I say implement, I mean set up, configure, perform any development, consult, etc., etc. So, but the cool thing, and how I'll tie this together, is interoperability. When I talk about that, I mean, hey, Business Central, nobody's more Microsoft than Microsoft, no matter what you hear out there in the marketplace. And this means that you'll have a familiar look and feel when you're looking at, say, a Business Central, which is the mid-market ERP flagship product for Microsoft under the Dynamics 365 family of products. And when I say interoperability, again, I mentioned it earlier, but I'll say it, it will interact with all your Office products. It'll live in the same cloud tenant and be able to quickly take advantage of and work seamlessly with Excel, importing, exporting, SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, etc. on the visualization side, and automation. You'll have Power Automate, Power BI, Power Apps, etc. So that it shortens the learning curve because it's something products you're already familiar with, and helps with that user adaptability.
Perfect. Maybe just should move along a little bit because we do want to get some Q&A in here, but just in terms of what Encore's advantages here. Encore has been around since 1990. We have teams in both Canada and the US. Darren's on the US side, I'm on the Canadian side. We have consultants, the width and breadth of most provinces and states in the USA. I would say, particularly in Business Central, where we have a very strong team in terms of how we support the product, how we partner with customers that coming from QuickBooks, other systems, in terms of how we work with them. And as Darren was alluding, we work across the platform in all facets of cloud deployment, Microsoft 365, SharePoint, Teams, more interestingly or excitingly into areas like Copilot today. So there's lots of strength that Encore has, and the platform, certainly in terms of Encore. We're very much, invested in the Microsoft products, and certainly that's the advantage that we take to our clients across the board.
Yeah, so we're aligned to that whole Microsoft picture. And what that gives you, a lot of times companies or smaller companies only have one tool or one product that they support and offer, one suite. So they're going to push that. Whereas we have the whole panoply of tools at our disposal and applications, Microsoft App Source, which has over 6,000 extensions, connectors, etc. The last time when I just checked the other day, it's really grown exponentially because the world knows that this is the hot product out in the market and the thing to move to. So we're very much aligned our practices around all of those options and opportunities. So we can find, when we speak with you, determine the right tool for the job or the right fit for your business. Okay, let's keep going.
How to get started with Dynamics Business Central? Give us a call. I'm sure Katie will give you some follow-up information if you want to get a hold of us. But I believe we're getting into the Q&A session here, Katie. So if you have any questions for us, Darren and I are certainly here to address any questions that are out there.
Of course. Thank you both. So if anyone does have any questions, you could enter them into the question area in the control panel. First one I'll get started with here is just how long would it take or does it take to move from QuickBooks to Business Central?
I can say, depending on your data, how clean it is, and I'm not going to have a big in-depth discussion here. We can talk about that more, but I would expect a typical implementation take a couple months, 2, 3 months total, but that includes, data migrations. It includes setting up and configuring your system as we discussed. It includes um, we training you on the new system, testing, so you ensure all your business processes and everything works, and then go live activities, so cut over, ensuring all the numbers tie out to your legacy or QuickBooks system if that was the case, and that everything's perfect. And then there's a little stabilization period of maybe 30 days to ensure all those processes you run maybe once a month, and everything else that didn't get picked up in testing, if anything else shows up or falls out of the hamper, we take care of that, and then you're live and stable on Business Central, and off you go.
Darren, Lincoln, did you have anything to add to that
Well, just,
answer?
yeah, I guess, sometimes in absolute time periods, I would say minimally, even on smaller implementations, we're looking at like 2 to 3 months, Darren, for an implementation. A medium will be from 3 to 6 to 9 months, and larger implementations. And sometimes, what's a large implementation? So often we deal with clients that have high, say, like manufacturing requirements. They have high supply chain requirements. They might have large, accounting finance requirements. So they have, once they really
Reporting.
get into reporting, sometimes Business Central is particularly strong in areas of multi-company, multi-currency setup configuration. So that can add to timelines. And you can imagine where we're getting back to our analogy around the box. If we're kind of building out a better, smaller box for you, it's going to take a shorter period of time. But this, these time frames can certainly range from, say, from 2 to 3 months up to over a year. But that's generally 4 to 6 months is a common frame point.
Cool. Any other questions for us?
I don't see any that are coming in right now. In the meantime, I'll add the link to our events page to the chat if you'd like to check out previous webinars or register for upcoming sessions. Darren, you actually have a session coming up in a couple weeks.
That's right. Wow, so soon.
You're getting
Yes.
some work out of you, Darren. There you go.
I know.
I'm also going to
Mark
add a
your
link where you can set
calendars.
your email preferences and opt in to our emails so that you can stay in the know about upcoming events and see our latest blog articles.
All right.
Well, wonderful. Thanks.
Yeah. I was just going to say we are at time now. So if anybody does have any questions that we weren't able to get to, we can get to through email after this webinar. But thank you, Darren and Lincoln, for the information. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.